Hey everybody, it is Tuesday. It is 5 o'clock. Wait, why am I excited about Tuesday at 5 o'clock? Tuesday is not a special day. 5 o'clock is not a special time, but today is a good day because we had talked about effects of the Industrial Revolution, and I do love that. But we'll get into that in a second. Hey, my name is Mason Logereau. I'm coming to you from Pflugerville, Texas. In fact, hey everybody, my Panthers. I'm repping my P today in the Austin, Texas area. Now, I mentioned the other day that Mr. Smith, the other teacher who's been doing these world history videos, is the cooler one out of the two of us. He claims that he is not. And then I realized, wait a minute, he might be right. I'm the one that lives in Austin. He has to live in Dallas. So yes, I am definitely much cooler than him. What am I thinking? If you live in Austin, you're great. It's a great city. All right. We are talking about the Industrial Revolution today. And all right, I said the other day that there were three things my students got tired of me mentioning in class this year. That is Buddhism spreading to East Asia through the Silk Roads, obviously the Mongols, and the Enlightenment, because I mentioned those things over and over in class because they're really important. Now, my students did not get tired of me mentioning the Industrial Revolution because sadly, school ended in March, kind of. But if we were in the classroom right now and we were talking about the 20th century and we got to go into as much detail as we could about the 20th century, they would also get tired of me talking about the Industrial Revolution. But it's a big deal. It affects, I mean, all kinds of things in our world today, right? How we work, how we consume goods. I mean, seriously, look around your room right now. I would bet that 95 to 100% of the things in your room right now were mass produced in a factory somewhere. From the smallest, cheapest things like pencils and pens to really expensive things like computers and TVs and cars. All of it was mass produced in a factory somewhere. That's because of the Industrial Revolution. And we don't have, we're not going to get into this today, but consider the impact on the environment and the burning of fossil fuels leading to climate change. That all happens because of the Industrial Revolution. So there's some major, major long-term effects of this that we need to look at. But today we're really going to focus on more the short-term effects of the Industrial Revolution. We're also going to continue talking about how to source a document in the DBQ, how to talk about the purpose, point of view, audience, historical situation, and all of that. And specifically, we're not going to talk about identifying it, because at this point, you should be able to identify the audience, but we're going to really talk about how to explain it, how to get to the so what of it, and what exactly you want to write in your DBQ. All right, so let's start with our warm up. We're going to go over the homework that Smith gave y'all last night. He gave you two documents and he gave you a prompt about how Asian governments affected the spread of industrialization in their states. And he asked you to write one body paragraph with a topic sentence, using the documents, analyzing the source, and then of course giving some evidence beyond the documents. So here's the paragraph that Smith wrote out. It's a beautiful one. It is perfect. But let's kind of go through it point by point so you can see what's expected of you on the DBQ. All right, as we've been talking about plenty already, each paragraph you want a topic sentence at the beginning. Give us a historical claim. And here Smith says that in Asian states, governments attempted, notice he put attempted there because they didn't always do it, but attempted to take direct control of the industrial process. All right, that is a perfectly valid historical claim. But now, of course, you have to use the documents to prove it. And then those next couple sentences he does. Notice he mentions his document 1 and document 2. He's talking about China and the Ottoman Empire. And in both cases, he's showing how these documents prove that governments are trying to take control of industry inside their country. So he's used the documents then to support the claim. And then we get into the sourcing, and he sources document 2. Now, we know that this document 2 is a letter to the Sultan. And he already said that in the sentence right above it, it must be directed by the Sultan, or I'm sorry, because the report is attempting to persuade the Ottoman Sultan to take action. So we know the audience is the Sultan, but it's not enough just to identify the audience. You have to give the so what, like, okay, who cares? The audience is the Sultan. Why is that important? And then he shows the document includes a lot of flattery of the Sultan. because they're trying to persuade him about the importance of railroads. So Smith then gives the so what of that sourcing. And you're going to have to be able to do that to get that sourcing point. And remember, especially this year and this year's DBQ, that's an important one because you can get 2 points from sourcing 2 different documents. Whereas under the old rubric that we've used in years past, you can only get 1 point for doing 3. So sourcing, I think, is almost one of those things where it's a little bit more important this year than maybe it is in previous DBQs. Now, because that also, let me kind of point out one thing about sourcing. Notice in here, Smith lays out his paragraph. It's well written, it's well organized. He's got the documents, he explains how they're being used, and then he gets into the sourcing of the documents. It flows very well, it's beautiful. Okay, ideally, this is what you would do on the DBQ. But as we've pointed out, you only have 45 minutes. The readers that are grading it know that you only have 45 minutes. They know it's not going to be the most beautifully organized essay you've ever written. You're not going to have time to go back and edit it. And we understand that. So one suggestion that I'm going to make, and I don't think this is best for everybody, but it might be best for you. And I'm going to leave this up to you and your teacher. I want you to have a conversation with your teacher about your strategies for the DBQ. When I grade AP tests, I have seen some students who save the sourcing for the end of their essay. Basically, they try and get all the other points, the thesis statement, contextualization, using the documents, outside evidence, all of that. And then if they have time, they kind of tack on the sourcing at the very end of the essay. Now, I hate even bringing this up because as a teacher, I kind of cringe when I see it because honestly, it doesn't flow very well. It's not a beautifully well-written essay, but it does get the points if you do that. Remember, sourcing is not required that it has to be in this paragraph. There's only one thing on the rubric that has to be in a certain spot, and that's your thesis statement. The thesis must be in your introduction or your conclusion. Everything else technically could be, theoretically, could be anywhere else in the essay. So if you're a student who's having trouble with sourcing, you don't feel real strong about it, you might want to consider writing the rest of the essay, get all the other points, and then if you're done with everything else, if you've gotten all the other points, then adding sourcing on to the end. Now, if your teacher has taught you to put it in the body paragraphs like Smith did here, then do that. Okay, if you feel comfortable doing this, do that. But talk to your teacher, have that conversation with them. I don't have a one size fits all rule for sourcing that says, put it here, put it there, because all of you are different. But talk to your teacher. They know you well. They know your writing. They can help you out with that. But consider where you might want to put the sourcing in your essay. Just food for thought that you might want to consider. All right, the last part is the evidence beyond the document. Notice the documents that you had for last night's homework. You had one from China, one from the Ottoman Empire. And then Smith adds in Japan and the Meiji Restoration. And he talked a little bit about that yesterday during his class. So by bringing in Japan, he's bringing in another example of an Asian state that was where the government was taking direct control of industrialization. And that is perfect. If you can bring another example in to prove your claim, that's your evidence beyond the documents right there, because Japan was not mentioned in either of the documents. So Smith, A+, great job on this paragraph. All right, but let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. And let's start off first with the social impact of what's happening here. Okay, first off, we know that industrialization and urbanization really go hand in hand. As factories begin to pop up across Europe and later the United States and later Japan and other parts of the world, you see cities really growing up around them. And that makes sense, of course, because remember, factories need a lot of workers. If you work in a factory, then you have to live within pretty much walking distance of the factory. Remember, we're in a time before cars. There's a little bit of public transportation in some places, but not really. So really, you're walking to work. Okay, so you need a lot of people living in a very small area around the factory. That's kind of the definition of an urban area and city, right? Lots of people living very closely together. So cities begin to grow because there's that need for workers. And then, as Smith also pointed out, opportunities for jobs in farming in rural areas is starting to decline. I'm not saying it's going away completely, because obviously we'll still need farmers for food, but job opportunities in rural areas are falling. Job opportunities in urban areas are growing. So you see people moving from rural areas to urban areas. So cities are continuing to grow. But that leads to a lot of problems. First off, remember, a lot of these factory jobs are not paying much at all. So workers don't have a lot of money to spend on housing. And so what you see is the rise of tenement buildings. So think of like apartments where it's multifamilies living under one roof, but extremely, extremely cramped, small rooms. In fact, in some of these tenement buildings, we're talking about rooms that are no bigger than like the average bedroom in the average American house today. But inside that one room, you might have 2 or 3 families living together. And I'm talking about mom, dad, kids, everybody, 2 or 3 families. And then as you can see from this picture here on the right, a lot of women and also girls are doing sewing at night to make a little extra money for the family. So they need room in that room. They need a space for all their work. So now you're even more cramped in. And this really hit home to me how cramped and dangerous the conditions were, because I went to New York City several years ago, and they actually have a tenement museum in Lower Manhattan. Which, by the way, if you ever go to New York, I would highly suggest you check it out. It was fascinating. And I know that you're thinking to yourself, yeah, Logero, tenement museum sounds great, because when I'm in New York, forget Times Square, the Empire State Building. Obviously, the first thing I'm doing when I get off the plane is going to the tenement museum. But actually, it was really cool. I went with a bunch of teachers several years ago. I know, sounds really exciting. But what they've done is they've actually remodeled one of the buildings to make it look like a tenement from the 1800s. And so when you walk in, you're really hit with just exactly how cramped it is. The hallways are extremely cramped. It's dark because there's not much indoor lighting. There's not much outside light either. Like I said, the rooms are really small. It's dirty. It's dusty. And so you can already see the problems that are emerging. Obviously, disease is going to spread. Hey, did y'all know that diseases spread when people are living close to each other? That's been in the news lately. Obviously, social distancing is not a thing when you have 3 families living in one room. Indoor plumbing was not a thing in most of these buildings. If you were lucky to have indoor plumbing in your tenement, that usually meant you shared one bathroom with the entire hallway, not just with your family, the entire hallway of multiple rooms. So yes, disease is going to spread that way as well. We see an increase in crime in these areas too. So urban living was very difficult on the working class poor. We see a lot of changes in labor and labor systems and how people work. Now, when you think of factories, you think of like dad's going off to work, bringing his lunch pail every day. And yes, obviously fathers, dads went off to work. But because salaries for many factory workers were so low, moms and kids also had to go work to support the family. And child labor becomes a huge issue, because you got to remember, men aren't getting paid much at all in these jobs. Women are getting even paid less than men, sometimes half to a third less. And kids are getting paid even less than that. So they're getting paid very little. And children are often having to do some of those dangerous work around, especially like working in mines. Think of like coal mines. Mine work is extremely difficult and extremely dangerous. You're working underground, there's cave-ins, you're breathing in all that soot and dirt, so it has long-term medical problems. But kids were often used to that kind of work because a lot of mine work also means like going into small areas that adults can't reach into. And if you think about it, if you're a 10-year-old boy working in a mine, then that's probably gonna be your job for the rest of your life. Because obviously you're not going to school, you're not getting an education. There's not much of a way to get out of that type of job. In fact, there was this really important moment in the 1800s when several kids went before Parliament, the Congress in England, and testified about their day-to-day life and talked about their schedule of waking up at 4:30 in the morning and going to work, working all day with very little breaks at all. And then again, once they got home at night, the girls especially were expected to continue working, doing sewing to bring in extra money. And this is when the public really started to understand what a terrible idea child labor was. And you start to see laws passed in England and eventually other countries, either outlawing child labor or putting severe restrictions on it. You also start to see, though, when it comes to labor, the rise of the middle class. And this is kind of a new thing. And it's something that, in the year 2020, most of us are used to because most of us are in the middle class, right? I mean, I got a job, I'm doing okay. I'm not super wealthy. I know y'all think teachers are rolling in it, but actually come to find out we're not. But I'm doing fine. Everything's good. I'm right there in the middle. And that's where most of us are. And you start to see the rise of the middle class because of new jobs that are available. Factories are being built. You need managers to run them. You need engineers to design them. You need accountants to count all the money. Goods are being manufactured. Well, somebody has to sell them. So you have shopkeepers that are selling them. All those jobs pay pretty decently well. You're not going to become super wealthy from being an engineer, but you're going to do pretty well. But the thing is, the middle class is a new thing that we really have not seen in world history very often. Through most of world history in most regions, you were either one of the economic elite, the top 2 or 3%, or you were everybody else. There wasn't much of a middle class, but now that's beginning to grow to where these days, most people, of course, are part of the middle class. But again, that's a new thing because of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the Industrial Revolution is bringing new transportation. Trains are making travel over land much quicker than before. Obviously, a train will get you to point A to point B much faster than walking or riding a horse. And when you think about trade, trains can carry a lot more goods. You can put a lot more goods on a train than you can on, say, a wagon being carried by a horse. Not carried by a horse, dragged by a horse, but you get my point. Steamships are obviously going to make water travel much quicker. You can go faster in a steamship than you can in a boat that's being powered by wind. And of course, with a steamship, you can go any direction you want. You can go with the wind or against it, or if the wind's not blowing, you can still move. So obviously, we're going to see an increase in long distance trade because of this, and in migration. People are moving around the world now in bigger numbers because of the Industrial Revolution. Some cases it's forced migration, as we'll talk about later, but also voluntary migration as well. All right, we also need to talk about a couple of economic responses to the Industrial Revolution. And the two big ones we need to talk about are capitalism and communism. When you think of capitalism, you need to know about Adam Smith. First off, he is a name that you do need to know and be able to recognize. Many consider him to be the father of capitalism. His most famous book is called The Wealth of Nations. You should know that as well, where he outlines the principles of capitalism. But the main idea behind capitalism is that governments should take a laissez-faire approach to the economy. Laissez-faire there, the French term meaning hands-off. That for the most part, governments should kind of remain out of the economy, allow market forces to take care of issues like prices or how much companies should produce or how much should they sell. Those things should be up to consumers and to businesses, and leave the government out of it is the idea behind capitalism. Now, the idea of governments taking less of a role in economies, that is a big change from the other prevailing theory of the time in mercantilism. Y'all remember in mercantilism, the idea was that governments should be making sure that companies in those countries are exporting more than they import. If the companies of a country are exporting more than they import, that means more money coming into the federal government, more money for the king, more military power, etc. Mercantilism is why you see countries really restricting trade with their colonies, only allowing those natural resources to go from the colonies to the mother country. So when we talk about capitalism, that really is a big shift away from mercantilism. But let's also consider that it doesn't mean a complete shift. Governments are not staying completely out of the economy, even in capitalist economies. First off, I don't know that you can even think of there's never been a really truly capitalist economy where the government's completely staying out of it, right? We still have countries, every country has some kind of tax system. There's always going to be regulations on companies for safety for workers and things like that. There's always going to be a social safety net for the poor, whether it be healthcare, housing, things like that. So there's never a situation where the government's completely hands off. But yes, some countries are definitely more capitalist than others. Now, a capitalist would look at the Industrial Revolution and say, this is a wonderful thing. We have more goods being produced than ever before, and a variety of goods being produced like we've never seen before. I mean, think about our country today in 2020. We as consumers do have a lot of options on what we want to buy. If I want to go to Best Buy and get a TV, I'll go, no, I'm not supposed to go to Best Buy. I will go online and want to buy a new TV. I can select from all kinds of different sizes, different brands, different styles. If I want to talk about a sound system with it, I can get all kinds of speakers. I mean, I can customize it almost any way I want. So I can pick the perfect TV that's going to fit my budget. And again, you got to think about fitting your budget, right? If there's a TV on sale, but it's too expensive, I'm not going to buy it. But that's where supply and demand comes in. But the point is, according to a capitalist, the Industrial Revolution gave us those options to buy nice TVs. Those are available to us. So now I can go buy the best TV for me to be able to watch, something like LSU winning the national championship. Oh, did I just squeeze that in that LSU won the national championship in football this year? Yes, I did. Go Tigers. All right, so we talked about capitalism. That means we also have to talk about communism. All right, you need to know Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, often considered the fathers of communism. It's kind of weird. Everyone knows about Marx. That's a name that lots of people know, but everyone always forgets about poor Engels. That's okay. I'm actually going to show you a document from him in a second, so you won't forget him. But when we think about Marx and Engels, first off, these guys are both Germans. They're living in the mid-1800s. They're living in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. For some reason, oftentimes, students think of Marx as like being Russian, and he wasn't. I think it's, because usually when we think of communism, we think of the Soviet Union, and I get that. But I want you to keep in mind, make sure you kind of understand the difference between Marx's view of communism and how it happened versus the communist revolutions of the Soviet Union and China, because there are some pretty big differences there. Things don't quite turn out like Marx predicted. Now, also to remember for this test, you don't need to talk about the Soviet Union or the Chinese Communist Revolution because those both happened after 1900. But I'm talking about more just for your own personal knowledge. Okay, but Marx and Engels both are living through the Industrial Revolution. And what they're seeing is that the problems of the Industrial Revolution, urban living and those things we talked about a second ago, low pay, dangerous working conditions in factories, all those problems are being put upon the poor working class. They're the ones that are really struggling. Yes, there are good things to come out of the Industrial Revolution, but all the bad things are now on the backs of workers. And so in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels both predicted that in the future, there would be this revolution of workers around the world. The workers would rise up and would seize the production. They would take over factories, they would take over farms, and then there would be this sort of utopia where everyone had what they needed and everyone, took care of each other. Now, again, that's obviously not how it turned out, but that was the idea put forth by Marx and Engels. Now, one thing that does come out of this is you do see a lot of labor unions sort of being spurred on by the ideas of Marx and Engels to give workers more power. Remember, labor unions become a very influential force later in the Industrial Revolution to help workers to get better pay, better working conditions, things like that. And remember, unions, the one thing unions had going for it is the power to go on strike, to get every person in the factory to stop working. Because if you can do that, then management has to listen up. Consider it this way. If one factory worker says, that's it, I quit until I get paid more work, or until I get paid more money. Well, the factory owner is going to say, okay, great, see ya, we're out of here. We're going to hire somebody else to take your place. One factory worker by himself has very little power. But if everybody's working together, obviously the factory owner cannot fire every single person. It's the same idea behind a boycott. If people want to boycott a certain company for whatever reason, you need a lot of people to boycott it. If I say that I'm going to boycott Nike because of the conditions of their factories in Asia, well, if I'm the only one doing it, Nike's not going to care. They're not going to miss the money I pay for one pair of shoes. But if you get enough people behind it, then you start to make a difference. Same thing goes for a strike. And they become very effective as labor unions begin to get all the workers in an area together. And you also see these ideas bringing about reforms for the poor in urban areas. So you start to see these urban areas getting cleaned up. You start to see sewer systems being installed underground to take waste out to help the spread of disease. You see government spending more for housing for workers so that families aren't squeezed into tiny tenements. So understand, even though things didn't quite happen like Marx and Engels predicted, you do see some people that are reforming based on their ideas. I really like this cartoon because it does a really good job of showing the communist critique of a capitalist system and the Industrial Revolution. So notice here at the bottom, I know the captions are kind of hard to read, but hopefully you can see them okay on your screen. Down at the bottom, you have all the workers, and notice how everything's being pushed down upon them. And it says, we work for all, we feed all. One level up, you have the upper middle class and the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, as communists would call it, saying we eat for you. By the way, speaking of bourgeoisie, don't forget that on the AP test, spelling doesn't count, which is really good. So if you spell bourgeoisie wrong, it's okay. You won't lose any points. Please, no one ask me to spell bourgeoisie right now, because if I had to do it off the top of my head, I think I would get some of those letters wrong, but that's okay. Give it your best shot. I've seen some very, let's just say, creative spellings of bourgeoisie over the years, but you'll be fine. All right, the next level up here, we have the military saying we shoot at you. And yes, governments did use military and police forces to break up strikes of workers. The government's argument was that some of these factories are essential for the national economy. Workers have got to be working. And yes, they would use violence and military tactics to get people back to work. Above that, you have the religious leaders saying we fool you. Oftentimes, communists were very, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of worried about religious leaders using religion to keep workers where they were, to tell workers, God wants you in this factory, you're helping the economy, and people kind of accepting that and accepting their lot in life. And then at the top, you have the political leaders and the king saying we rule you, but really at the top is a large bag of money labeled capitalism. So again, this is a communist critique of the capitalist system that you would often see in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. All right, let's take a second and move away from the history content talk for a second. Let's talk about sourcing. I'm going to give you two documents. We're going to start with this first one here. And I want you to think about, how would you source this if you're writing a DBQ? So in a second, when I say go, I want you to pause the video. I want you to read over the document. And then I want you to think about, write out a couple sentences. How would you source this if you're writing the DBQ? So again, remember, you got to think about audience, historical situation, purpose, or point of view, or kind of a combination of any of those. But you don't just identify it. You have to also explain the so what of it. Okay. So this is from a company that's called Whelan and Company. They were writing this. They were a major company in Manchester, England, which is a pretty important industrial city in England in 1852. And here they are writing about Manchester, the city. So go ahead and pause the video now, read over it, and then write a 1 or 2 sentence sourcing of the document, and I will be here when you return. Okay, here's what I wrote. Again, you might have something different, and if you do, that is totally fine. And mine kind of gets into purpose, but a little bit of point of view. But as we've talked about before, sometimes purpose and point of view kind of bleed into each other. So if you do a little bit of some, a little bit of the other, that's totally fine. It's not like you have to label it. And it's not like if you start with purpose and then end up at point of view, they're going to mark it wrong. As long as you're sourcing it, as long as you're talking about the importance, as long as you're bringing in some kind of outside thoughts to bear on it, you're good. Okay, so I put for purpose in that first city, Whelan and Company want to celebrate Manchester and show it in the best light. Okay, that's purpose / point of view, however you want to talk about it. But then notice I also bring in a little bit of historical situation, but a little bit of a so what. Okay, Manchester was definitely a major manufacturing center, no doubt about it. These guys are right. Goods from Manchester did make it all the way around the world. And Manchester's home to 2 of my least favorite soccer teams in Manchester United and Manchester City, but we're not talking about that right now. But notice that the money coming into Manchester did not make its way to the workers who are working for low wages in dangerous conditions. Now, I would not expect the author of this document to bring this up because they're trying to show the best about Manchester. They're not going to talk about all the problems. So that's a limitation of the document that you can definitely bring into sourcing. Notice I didn't say he was biased, because I mentioned this in a previous video a couple weeks ago. I don't like using that word bias. Every document has some kind of bias. But you as a historian have to kind of look past that and think about the limitations of it. That's the job of the historian, to look past the bias and look towards the limitations. What can you get out of this document, but what do you need to be careful about with it as well? All right, let's try another one. I told y'all we'll come back to Frederick Ingalls. This was something he wrote in 1844, again about the city of Manchester. So we're going to do the same thing again. You're going to pause the video here in a minute. I want you to read the document and then talk about the sourcing, historical situation, audience, purpose, point of view for this. So ready, go. Okay. So again, I was thinking kind of about point of view here. I said Ingalls is writing a description of Manchester. He is accurate in this description, but he's choosing to focus on the worst working class areas. Not the entire city of Manchester was not as terrible as it points out here in this document. Yes, this was a really bad area, and yes, this is real, but it's not like that all over the city. But notice the purpose here. He's trying to highlight the problems of industrialization. He's hoping for reforms, or even possibly that worker rebellion that he and Marx talked about. So he's trying to bring the problems to the forefront. So notice here, again, we have limitations of the author. He is not telling you everything you need to know about Manchester, just like the first document wasn't either. So you have 2 pretty conflicting views here on what Manchester's like. Both of them are kind of correct, but also hiding a lot of things from you too. But again, as an historian, you have to take these together to figure out the historical truth. I think about this because one of the biggest, longest papers I had to write when I was in college at UT was on the role of the Catholic Church and stopping the Holocaust in World War II. And so I did what every young history student does. I went to the library. I had a bunch of primary sources. I had some from Catholic sources that said the Pope was doing everything he could to stop the Holocaust. Well, that's not quite true. But I also had some anti-Catholic sources saying, oh, the Pope is totally cool with the Holocaust. In fact, he's helping Hitler out. Okay, well, that was definitely not true either. Okay, so you have 2 very extreme points of view. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but you got to be able to find it by doing your research. Same thing here with these sources. So think about limitations of these documents as well when you're doing the sourcing. Okay, one more thing I want to think about is the kind of overall economic impact around the world. First off, we start to see the rise of transnational businesses. companies that are doing business in more than one country. Remember, for so long, if you had like a small factory, you would make a few things here and sell it to the people in the neighboring areas. But now we've got these large factories that are producing more goods than we've ever seen before. Well, they're producing too much to just sell to people in the area. They're looking for new markets overseas. And they also need more natural resources to put into the factory to get the manufactured goods. So you start to see this desire by European governments and European businessmen for natural resources and markets. Where can you find natural resources and markets? Well, we're going to talk about that more tomorrow and Thursday when we start talking about imperialism. In fact, on Thursday, I'm going to talk about economic imperialism, and I'm going to talk about the importance of some of these natural resources, including, I'm going to spend a little time talking about bird guano on Thursday. And if you're not familiar with what guano is, yeah, we're talking about bird poop on Thursday. It is actually extremely important in the 19th century for farming. And it was actually a series of fights over bird poop, and we'll talk about that more, but you got to wait till Thursday for that. But the point is, companies are starting to do business all around the world. Now, that's something we're pretty used to today, right? You know that Nike doesn't just sell shoes and shorts and shirts to people in the United States. They sell them around the world. Apple sells computers to people all over the world. That's something that we're used to in the year 2020. But it is something that's beginning during the Industrial Revolution. And you also have this need for stock markets. Stock markets have been around for a while, but they become really important during the Industrial Revolution because factory owners need capital. They need money, investments to open up these new factories. It's not cheap to open up a factory. Well, selling stock is one way to get a very quick infusion of capital. Remember, when you buy a stock in a company, you're buying a piece of ownership in that company, a very, 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 very small piece of it, but that money can be used by the company to go build more factories and to invest it. And so, in fact, this picture right here is of the stock exchange in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And notice a couple things. One, it's extremely crowded. There's a lot of people there showing the importance of it. And if you look at the clothing, a lot of different clothing styles as well, because these are people not just from the Netherlands, but from all over Europe and all over the world. Because again, we're talking about transnational businesses. These businesses are operating all over the world. Now, the other thing I want you to consider about the Industrial Revolution, people always think of it as a European phenomenon. And I mean, in a sense it is. It started there. You definitely see industrialization in Europe quicker than anywhere else. But we do see in other places as well. The United States begins doing it pretty soon after the countries of Europe, and pretty much follow that European model of, we say laissez-faire capitalist policies, but you also know the United States government was, pretty into helping companies invest and giving land for railroad companies and things like that. Yesterday, Smith talked about Japan and their industrialization in the late 1800s during the Meiji Restoration, kind of coming after Europe and the United States had already pretty fully industrialized and in response to American expansion. And then in China and the Ottoman Empire, you do see some attempts at industrialization, but the economic elites of those countries were not really behind industrialization. And it kind of makes sense why, right? If you're an economic elite in one of those areas, you're doing pretty well. You've got plenty of money. Why would you want to see the entire economy change from what's been working for you? And so without the backing of the economic elite, manufacturing and industrialization is really slow going in those areas. And on Thursday, I'm going to talk to you about the problems that leads to for China and the Ottoman Empire. Hint, hint, Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. But we'll get there on Thursday. All right. So again, I want you to be thinking about the major effects of the Industrial Revolution. We really talked a lot about the short-term ones, but just think about it in the world today, in your life. Think about the long-term effects as well. And then As I've been saying with sourcing, this is an extremely important skill this year for the DBQ. You can now get 2 points for sourcing. So keep that in mind also. All right, your homework for tonight is already in the Google Drive. It's called 5.7 to 5.10 homework. You've got 2 documents there. All I want you to kind of work on is think about the sourcing for that, okay? Don't just identify audience point of view, purpose, historical situation, but go a step further, make sure you're explaining the so what of it as well. Hey, this person's writing to blank. Okay, cool. So what? All right, one more thing before we go. Smith mentioned this yesterday, but in case you didn't catch it, quill.org does a lot of good lessons on writing, especially on writing skills. And right now they're offering some free lessons for AP students through the College Board, which is really cool. So if you need some work on grammar, syntax, that sort of thing, check out what they're offering at quill.org/AP. Now, Smith did bring up a very important fact yesterday, and I've mentioned it a few times as well. Technically, spelling and grammar do not count on the AP test. I promise you, no one is going to read your essay and look at it and go, oh, they put a comma there, but there should be a semicolon. How dare they? And take all your points away. That is definitely not going to happen. Okay. But if you feel kind of unsure about your writing skills, or maybe just want a little bit of help, go ahead and check out what they have. I think it could be helpful for you. So go to quill.org/AP, see what they have to offer. Don't worry too much about it, because again, spelling and grammar don't count on this test, but it could be a little bit of a confidence boost for you. All right, y'all have a good night. Smith will be with y'all tomorrow on Wednesday, and I will see you Thursday. Good night.